A very exciting third day of the talks. We have very enriching conversations lined up for the day. And I want to start by thanking JSW for generously supporting the program this time for India Art Fair's landmark 15th edition. Art Across has been designed to celebrate the power of critical dialogue and the critical need for celebrating the arts as well. We are covering key issues in art design and architecture from a variety of perspectives, including institutions, our market experts, philanthropists, creatives, artists, and curators, as you can see. All our talks are also being interpreted in Indian Sign Language. I'll quickly introduce our first panel for the day so that they have the entire time to talk about their practices. We have leading curators, Anushka Rajendran, who's the curator of Prameya Art Foundation, Neeraja Poddar, the Ishara Brind, and Stacey, Spector, associate curator of South Asian art at Philadelphia Museum of Art. We have Rattanamol Singh Johal, who's the assistant director at international program with the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA. We have Sabih with us. Sabih Ahmed is the associate director and curator of Ishara Art Foundation, and Vidya Shivadas, who's the director of the Foundation for Indian Contemporary Art, FICA. And they'll be sharing their observations on the shifting landscape of curatorial practices and criticism in the arts today. We have on board Arnika from Museum of Art and Photography, Bengaluru. She'll be moderating the conversation. And without further ado, I would actually hand over to Arnika to take the lead on this one.
Thank you, Priya, and thank you, Anushka and Hashada, for looking after us so well. I'm glad that all of you could come on this very cold morning in Delhi. I feel very honored to be able to moderate such a fantastic panel of curators from different parts of the world and having this opportunity today to speak to you all. While we have about 40 minutes for this conversation, we'll be inviting questions from the audience afterwards, so please take notes or feel free to chip in with any questions you might have towards the end. And I thought I'd start with asking questions about your specific contexts so that you can speak a little bit about your practice, and then open up the floor to more broader questions and maybe concerns that we can think about collectively. And what drives our work in a way. So to begin with, I thought we could start talking about the role of the curator and how it has changed. And it has changed a lot in the last decades or two. I think the role of the curator in the Anglo-American context is still very different in terms of people looking after collections or organizing exhibitions, while in Europe, curators are often more looking at research or concepts for exhibitions. And I was thinking how the practice has changed in India or South Asia, and maybe you can relate to that through your own practice. Anybody who would like to start? No specific. Anushka.
I'm usually the one who begins these conversations. So I work in America, which is obviously a very different context from what we have. More mic, like this? Okay. And I think a lot of what I do as a curator of South Asia is explain what South Asia is for people, and that we are a diverse culture, etc. And it's not one monolithic single culture with language. But within most museums in America I've seen, the curator is no longer this sort of figure who dictates what art is or what culture is, and we've sort of been tasked with becoming community partners and working with our audiences and our heritage communities, because there's a large South Asian community where we live, and to engage them, to bring them in, and to respond to the needs of our audiences. So I feel in that way my role has shifted, even in the 5 years that I've been there. That it's not just what I want to do. I have to take into account my audiences.
Community is definitely a focus. Just to add to that, and I feel that many of us here also relate to the fact that we consider our practices in an expanded sense, where it's not just limited to curating exhibitions, but also thinking through support structures for artists in ways that perhaps don't exist, which is the primary part of my role at Prameya Art Foundation. And also making space for other curators and working with them, and especially Vidya in your work as well, I'm sure it reflects especially strongly working in Delhi, both of us. And I mean, yes, as Arnika, you mentioned, the role of a curator as someone who is in care of the material and conceptual integrity of an artistic practice has shifted. I mean, it still remains a primary role, but at the same time, it has expanded to more discursive methods of working and also taking care of artists as well and practices and sustaining conversations.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I think if I just think back also about curation and a lot of my primary connection and entering exhibition making was with artists, because I did work in institutions and I have always worked in institutions over 2 decades, both in a gallery and in a non-profit. And I think the exhibition and the curatorial has always been a very important expressive force, a potent force, that a form that artists have always worked with. And that has been a very interesting learning ground. And we do see, of course, that form opening up, even, and because one has worked with artists so closely, one always sees the way that the curatorial and the exhibitory presents possibilities of sort of, yeah, this kind of very creative force that they're working with. And I mean, I was just thinking back about, spending time with someone like Mrinalini Mukherjee and working with her specifically on an exhibition very early in my practice, and just thinking about, the way that she would think about sort of displaying sculpture, which in itself is not, it's not as if it, presents itself in a very fixed way. So, I mean, and today what we're also seeing is that, of course, the exhibition and the curatorial has moved from a more static form, which into something very dynamic, into a process of becoming, where one is thinking about relationalities and about kind of dialogues and co-production that is possible. And so there is that opening up of the space of the curatorial that one has also experienced through one's own practice. And today, as I work at a foundation where we are giving grants and we're looking at learning platforms, and the exhibition becomes a very interesting site where, and part of that larger process of working with artists and working with audiences, and not necessarily thinking of them as very separate departments, but, thinking of them creatively, so.
That's the last one, Sabih. Thank you. I think I very much relate to many of the things that have already been said, but specifically in the role that I currently occupy at MoMA, I really see my work as creating both context and connections. And my ambit is not limited to South Asia, but South Asia is something that I have invested a lot of time and energy in being part of as a network, but also as a research focus. And so to think about how in the context of a large museum, a 94-year-old institution that has had a certain role in the history of modernism, what it means to open up connections to places that have not been so well represented in those narratives, and also what it means to start to bring more works into the collection or have conversations on an ongoing basis that create the possibility of introducing those voices, those perspectives, those formal vocabularies into our galleries and into our program in a way that actually reads across many different registers. And just thinking of someone like Mrinalini Mukherjee, since you mentioned her, Vidya, I think, we were fortunate to be able to acquire one of her large sculptures from 1984, and it was very moving in the installation of that work to see a dialogue being set up there along the lines of figuration and portraiture and sort of feminist representation in some ways, with peers from many places in the world, but specifically I thought the juxtaposition with Ana Mendieta's Silhouettas, or with Sofia Kulik or Geta Bratescu, a Romanian artist, were very evocative and opened up the work to readings that one doesn't necessarily encounter in a more monographic presentation, or let's say a more regionally specific presentation. And so that's just one sort of sliver of the kind of work that's happening. But the research program that I help run is working across currently working across Southeast Asia, West Asia, and Africa. And so that's sort of the current landscapes that we've been delving into and thinking about very deeply, but we can get into that later.
Good morning, everyone. Please excuse me, I'm going to make some readings from notes as well as I respond. First of all, I think my own introduction into the curatorial discourse was very much within Delhi, and in a context where there was a very rigorous kind of thinking about the curatorial via FICA, via Coach, via JNU, where I studied, via Kochi Musicians Biennale, and within the Kochi Musicians Biennale, the Students Biennale that Vidya had been leading, Rux Media Collective, a whole lot of readings and readers, which I think you can find in many of these libraries, which had discussions by Irit Rogoff and Paul O'Neill and so many others. And of course, from within this context, Geeta, Kapoor, and many others. And what I think, at least in my own introduction to this, because initially I had a great apprehension towards even identifying myself as a curator, because I thought it was extremely industry-driven, networking, that kind of thing, until as I got more introduced into these kinds of discussions, one realizes that actually it's much more than that, and that kind of also differentiated itself between curation and the curatorial, and the curatorial not being merely vocational, but rather as a form of thought, as a form of thinking and discourse. Just like the artistic or the architectural, those don't have to be located within exhibition making, right? And one thing I think in more recent years, and especially since COVID, which became increasingly apparent, and this is what me and friends have been discussing, is recalling so many seminars on curating, which always went back to the etymology, and the etymology being one of care. And then sort of realizing that actually something has shifted, and that discourse of care is a care for something else, because the amount of layoffs that happened across institutions and museums of various staffs, and especially of education staffs around the world, then you sort of start thinking, what exactly is the care for? And then you kind of then go into thinking, oh, so is this care really a care for objects? And then once you go into that, then you start thinking, oh, so if it's care for objects, then it's practically asset management. If it's a care for knowledge, then actually it's a care for power consolidation. Who has knowledge over whom, and who's going to write history? So then it's got to shift out of that etymology and produce a discontinuous history from the discourse of care towards something else. So what is that something else going to be? I think some of us are figuring it out. And I think at least some of the things that I've been discussing with friends and trying to bring into practice is a kind of discussion where perhaps we might need to start thinking of differentiating and even dissociating the curatorial from the museological. And where the museological has primarily begun its very close ties, maybe all over again, with the mercantile. So you can see this kind of collusion between the curatorial and, between the museological and the mercantile. And you can see this literally exemplified by the number of fairs happening in the world and the number of museums that attend those fairs more than any other event. I mean, the number of museums just congregating in fairs, you really wonder what's going on. So the museological and the mercantile, the museological and the privatization of museums, and the museological within the larger kind of epistemological rubric of taxonomical. So then the work of the curatorial is actually to dislodge or do something to all of those. To do something to the museological, maybe even against the museological, or do something to the mercantile, to the kind of privatization and managerialization of art and culture. And so then what is the curatorial? It's perhaps, and at least in the kind of things I try to do or identify and get inspired by, is a kind of practice that allows not necessarily consolidation, because the museological was about consolidation, a consolidation of property, and then kind of take it into channeling, assembling, dispersing, deterritorializing and reterritorializing both knowledges, subjects, objects, all of those things. And what's the kind of end project in this? Why is one doing this? And it takes me to at least a lot of work that Irit Rogov had been doing, where she, in one of her texts, defined what is the project as the project is perhaps a production of new subjects, and experimenting with new subjects and subjectivities, and therefore an experiment with what a society can be. And I think some of these things really got exemplified in the recent documenta that happened. You could see even the people who were in favor and supported the documenta were making this claim, which was a kind of backhanded compliment that, it was more about ethics, not aesthetics. As if aesthetics is only commodity aesthetics, and anything that's not commodity aesthetics is ethics. So actually then the question becomes that is a process-driven practice, is something that is transformative in form and in concept and in execution necessarily outside of the realm of aesthetics, or has the aesthetics been hijacked into something else? So I think the curatorial find in the end, being a curator, is like testing these forms of thought and practice, and I think that's how it kind of at least resonates most with me and how I try to now go with it.
Yeah, thank you. I think we'll pick up on some of the aspects that you have just mentioned a little bit later in the conversation as well. I think for me personally, in my practice, it's also, there's of course the care for objects, but the museum I work in, I think we continuously try to extend it in terms of care for audiences as well, and to really think of ourselves as the people who ask the questions of why would that be relevant to somebody who comes to the museum, and how can we create this relevance, and how can we create something that really holds meaning to the people who come to see these exhibitions. And that sometimes means a personal compromise of what would interest us to do. But it's an interesting challenge that I really like to work in. But yeah, I wanted to come back to another question, because I think the Art Fair invited us to speak a little bit about South Asian art. And maybe we can get that out of the way right in the beginning and think a little bit about what South Asian art means to you, and which aspects of it matter in your work. While then in the conversation we can talk about art in much broader terms perhaps. But yeah, I wanted to throw this question back to you all and hear from you, what does South Asian art mean to you? And feel free to talk about examples, projects and exhibitions as well.
The question really takes me back to this panel that I was moderating. I happened to be moderating in Colombo recently, which brought together artists who've been working from their local context across Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka as a space to share strategies of working together and build solidarities in ways that wouldn't be possible in another context that is not Sri Lanka because of the specific political and geographic circumstances within which we operate. And at the same time, the shared histories and sometimes the methods of working, the modes of working that can overlap and that we can learn from each other. So in that sense, South Asia as a region is also a way of working against various infrastructural odds as much as anything else, and thinking beyond political borderlines to arrive at a regional state of mind and what that might be, and explore that within curatorial or exhibition narratives. is something that I've been very sensitive to.
I mean, I think the question of the region, is also we necessarily at FICA and do end up working a lot with practitioners in the country, but we're also looking at practices that are happening on the ground, and we're thinking about specificities of regions everywhere. We recently started a grant called the Himalayan Fellowship, and we're looking at practices coming from Western Himalayas down to the Northeast. And each of these places, there are very interesting practices happening, firstly, that we never get to know even in a city like Delhi. I think we are also finding that people are working and responding and creating having very interesting creative responses to and speaking to places. And the grant was also sort of geared like that it was about people from the region working on the region. And I think this whole question of, the larger categories of South Asia are very important because there are a lot of solidarities and certain kinds of shared context and infrastructural and others that we do work with. But it's also trying to think closely with different places and trying to think about different practices, which are very diverse, actually. I mean, even this notion of India is not something that is necessarily understood or contained in any of the kind of forums that we associate. So I think, and I mean, I also think that there are, even within the museological, and I mean, I understand these broader categories that you're bringing in, but I think there are lots of unexpressed and unexplored relationalities between practices, between works, that, within, say, art history, of at least of the contemporary and the space of art writing, haven't necessarily, really been given the kind of space. So I think the curatorial does bring out an interesting way of sort of complicating those pictures. But I mean, I do take your point about larger thinking about how the curatorial can read against that. And I do like the fact that I work in such a small organization also that is porous enough to be able, and that's why I started also sort of locating my learning with artists, because I think it's also nice that I work in an institution where I can sort of have a reverse osmosis process where something the curatorial also can sort of have a dialogue with the way that artists are thinking, and this whole relationship between the exhibition and the institution is something that can sort of also impact the institution. And of course, these things work in very different temporalities. If, the exhibition is something that's short-lived, it produces an extremely charged, energetic space. It proposes a lot of things, and it is a larger collective energy. It's not necessarily orchestrated by one mind alone. It's this assemblage of things and forces and energies that come together, and it produces certain kinds of changes, and gets dispersed within every body that enters and impacts institutions in different ways, and one must be vigilant that those energies do get carried. So that for me, that is an interesting kind of coming together.
I would say that South Asia, for me, has provided a very important lens, a kind of vantage point from which to develop categories and ideas that help me approach transnational research and thinking. Just thinking about the ways in which certain artists that I've personally been invested in or researching for a long time now, practice modes of documentary or figuration that open up conversations that don't necessarily have to go through the former so-called centers of the art world, and specifically being in a place like New York and thinking about what an institution like MoMA can do in this moment to present and think about the connections between, let's say, an artist like Amar Kanwar, whose work, The Torn First Pages, we showed in an exhibition called Signals last year around the politics of video, and how that might connect with the kind of work that an artist like Neil Yalter, a French-Turkish artist who's going to be winning the Golden Lion in Venice this year for Lifetime Achievement, has been doing in that mode since the 1960s in parts of Turkey and outside Paris, which she made her home. I think it's really important to, going back to something that Sabih was bringing up, to maintain a sensibility around how the ethical, aesthetic, and political aspects of these practices are not lost in making these connections within gallery displays. The kind of complexity of those three terrains is really something that one has to specifically think and rethink when you're putting together something that may not necessarily be directly connected in an art historical narrative that is regional or geographically specific, but actually there are many possibilities within the space of a collection, and I'm really talking from a collecting institution in that sense, which is of course very much implicated in many of the things that you were talking about, but yet there are possibilities in terms of actually doing the work in the galleries, and sometimes it's not even in the galleries, it's thinking about how other kinds of research platforms, publications, the space of the internet, which one has to negotiate and renegotiate at all times, can provide ways in which we can continue to kind of struggle to keep those that triangulation alive.
Again, I think my approach is very different because I care for historic collections. In a large museum where we have galleries dedicated to what is called South Asian art. So we have to think about it differently. There's a space which is defined as South Asia. There's a map that you put up on the wall that shows you which countries are South Asia. And part of the challenge is, as I think many of you have discussed in the context of the contemporary, is to maintain the unique character of South Asia while trying to engage in these transnational dialogues, as Ratan was saying. So it's a lot of the ways in which historic art has been typically displayed in, say, an American museum has been chronologically and by region. So part of the challenge for me is breaking out of these very standard ways of displaying art. And so in a way, it's not being region specific, but I think it's again different when we look at the historic material and creating themes that everyone can relate to in a way. So whether it is devotion, this is relevant across cultures. But sure, I get that when you work with the contemporary, if the work is very specific to a place, it's really important to acknowledge that and not lose it in the noise of the larger South Asia context.
Because I work at a rather small organization just like FICA and Prameya, I think we keep our inquiries quite specific. And one of the things at least I've been doing in approaching this question of what is South Asia, where is South Asia, is to kind of take it outside of this representing a place called South Asia and the artists from there, because Ishara is primarily dedicated to presenting contemporary art from South Asia. But in this, something I learned, at least from AA, was one of the key, Asia Art Archive where I worked before, was a key kind of concept that drives a lot of projects, which was complex geography. And so then to regard South Asia not as a geographic entity, but as a historical concept or a historical formation. And once you realize it's a historical formation, then you know that it's not immutable, it keeps changing. And more importantly, it means different things in different places. So what South Asia means and represents in Dubai is different from what South Asia means and represents in London, in Australia, in New York, and within India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, all of these places. And so you also then start realizing that it starts signifying different things. And therefore, how do we bring that into our exhibitions and complicate that? And so one's aware also of the fact that in Dubai, there is a very large diasporic kind of population. And so that kind of immediately takes you into looking at what does migration mean vis-a-vis South Asia, but vis-a-vis any kind of region. And then when you start looking at that, then I think it's inevitable to realize that migration is a contemporary condition. And once you're there, what does it mean? And the different conditions within which movement happens of people, of communities, and then what does history mean? Because we deal so much with contemporary art, we sometimes invite artists to come and curate and kind of share their kind of approach to such questions. So one example of that was actually a project that we invited by inviting an artist and photographer, Sohrab Hura, who then formulated very beautifully and powerfully this exhibition that was in multiple iterations called Growing Like a Tree. And so while Ishara is focused on presenting contemporary art from South Asia, via such curations, you end up having artists from many other geographies come in because they speak to the artist's practice or the curator's practice. And that kind of then, again, complicates not only geography, but also history and where we're going from here. So that's primarily how we've kind of located it. Now, one more thing to add, that when sitting in at least the UAE, you realize there's a lot of nostalgia around South Asia. And that nostalgia is not just simply sentimental nostalgia, it's a nostalgia industry. And you can see that kind of translating into also the cultural industry as such, the art industry as well. And so there's a lot of nostalgia around South Asia and a lot of cashing in on South Asia via this kind of pre-partition narrative, which of course has its realities, but it also has all kinds of other blind spots. So how does one kind of start in interrogating those? So we try to do that, and actually in the coming month, where we attempted to have a discussion around this in one of the issues presented by Take on Art magazine, where we approach various people in the field, and of course it's a very modest attempt at looking at what does South Asia signify to different practitioners in different places, in different museums, organizations, and institutions. And one thing I've been kind of more and more confronting and seeing is that while there's a lens of South Asia that is presented via, say, area studies, and then another one by economies and the economic discourse, there's actually a South Asia that is also being defined by xenophobia. Because when a certain marginalized community is asked to go back, they're not asked to go back to Saudi Arabia or Myanmar or some other place. They're asked to go back to specifically Pakistan or specifically Bangladesh or those kind of things. So there's a contour being drawn of South Asia by xenophobia itself, at least within this part of the world. So then one has to look at actually what does South Asia signify, not just for those who are interrogating the colonial and pre-partition narratives, but also what does it signify at this very moment vis-a-vis go back kind of politics,
I wanted to stay a little bit with the question of working with artists. And I think Vidya and Sabih, both of you have already spoken a little bit about that. But maybe you can talk about it a little bit more, and I think Rattanamol is also something that you often engage with, but a lot of artists have been curating exhibitions as well, and curators often invite artists to curate exhibitions. What kind of possibilities does that open up, and what may be the challenges, because it's also to a certain degree handing over something, and what has come out of it for you? Maybe Rattan, do you want to?
Sure, I can start off. I think just looking back at a slightly longer, I don't know if this is working properly, but maybe I can borrow Arnika's. Thank you. One of my first curatorial jobs was at Coj here in Delhi, and I spent about 2 years there. and then went off to pursue my doctoral studies. But I think the contrast between working in a large institution, a large collecting museum like MoMA, and thinking through this kind of let's say over a decade of different kinds of engagements with artists is revealing in looking at the kind of limitations and possibilities that these different contexts provide. Certainly, I'm just doing a microphone juggling situation. I'd say from the position now, I really feel that what I'm learning from all of the artists that we are constantly in dialogue with, and it really is a pleasure to have a kind of long, slow process of dialogue with artists, because our mandate is not to purchase a certain number of works or make a region-specific acquisitions committee, report to them about exactly what is coming in with the contributions they're making. So we have the luxury in some ways of working with a whole range of interlocutors, of which artists are one of the most significant groups. And just over the past about year, I would say, I've been working very closely and thinking very closely with Camp in Bombay, and we have been talking about some of the ways in which their works and the platforms that they've managed to build across different fields of practice, from thinking very critically about the presence of surveillance technologies in urban space to actually questions of the Creative Commons, of the kind of large archives of moving image, cinematic image, and many other forms of images that they've worked with, are very much at the heart of an exhibition that I referenced earlier, Signals, that we did in New York last year, where the kinds of research and works that they've made over the last decade, I would say, have really informed how we approached video as a network and as something that was sort of infinitely multipliable, movable, modifiable, and that gave us a perspective onto many other artist practices that had not necessarily been read in those terms, and maybe a different history of video altogether. And of course, their work at the Kochi Biennale and recently shown at Sassoon Docks in Bombay, Bombay Tillstown, which is really an incredible kind of summation of many threads of their own research, is something that we were fortunate to now be able to bring into the collection after this long dialogue. So I would say that has been a really revealing and gratifying process.
And Neeraja, maybe you could speak a little bit about working with historical material, but bringing in artists, contemporary artists, to respond to the material and what your experiences have been.
Yeah, so we have a few such projects that we do, and some of it is very obvious, but we have this beautiful 17th century book made in the Deccan called the Gulshan-e-Ishq, and we asked Shazia Sikandar, who's a famous New York and Pakistani New York-based artist, to actually use that to create a video installation, which we installed in 2016. So I think the museum, which has historic and contemporary collections, is recognizing the importance of engaging audiences using the contemporary, but as you said, connecting it with the historical. So we recently, 2 years back, I did this little exhibition called Encounters in Exile. And for me, it was a response to the pandemic. I was living in America. I couldn't travel back home. I felt exiled. So I took the theme of exile from the Ramayana and used that bit of the story. But we brought in a work by Atul Dodia, we brought in a work by Jaidev Baghel, as a way of showing that these are themes that have continued, and there are ways of bringing together the past with the present, or the historical with the contemporary, in a dialogue. It's not a seamless always, but you can engage them together and create meaning in different ways. So that's just a project that I really enjoyed. And this was all from our own collection. None of it is borrowed. And it's something we have to work with constantly, because our historic works stay on view permanently. And the only way to activate those spaces, if you're not doing an exhibition, is to bring in the contemporary, is to bring in artists, to engage with them, either by talking about the works or by interpreting them or installing something else alongside it. So it's definitely something that we're very conscious of.
And Vidya, would you like to speak a little bit about building long-term relationships with artists? Because I think that's something FICA has been truly amazing at. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a work in progress. Given the kind of funds we have, we end up giving small grants, and then we kind of think around how one could sustain, and the idea of sustaining relationships, and because of course you're also working in a field where a lot of people there nothing is monetized apart from what you see at this art fair, and a lot of people in the creative sector also work without being paid and things like that. So it's also a way, how do you create a community when you're thinking about these questions also of people's sustainability in terms of their own economic conditions. And so for us, I mean, we see ourselves in a city where there are a lot of art colleges. We see a lot of young artists here who are struggling and living in this city because there is a lot of opportunities. And so the hope is that we find ways in which there can be a space that they can come to, one among many other spaces in the city, of course, and feel comfortable. And I was just thinking about, Priyanka's here, and I was just thinking about this particular exhibition that we did in her studio, which was going to be demolished. Actually, she was working in an old home, and there was a time when we didn't have a reading room ourselves. We had no home. And we went and occupied this space, which was a house in Pamposh Enclave, and spent 6 weeks there. It was a very interesting, very learning experience for us, because this whole relationship between the inside and the outside, the home, the space of the intimate, or a space of maybe something that is your own private in a sense, and then this public, that the artists who were working in that space, who were inhabiting the space that we had invited, Priyanka and FICA had invited, it was an interesting kind of, different ways in which they were sort of expressing this relationship. And it also gave us a sense, and we set up a small temporary library in the ground floor with a structure that Sushanta Mandal designed for us. And it gave us a sense of, how one mediates this space, which is a creative space, or the space where one, of care and nurture, and then mediates a conversation with the outside world, which each artist was also exploring in that site. And of course the studio space itself. So in that sense, I mean, these are sort of working relationships. They inform us, and we hope that we're able to create certain momentum and for the artists also. So
I think we're running a little bit out of time, but I wanted to touch upon one larger question, which is that globally a lot of exhibitions look at environmental concerns, and at the same time, if we look at this in this region, then there is an interconnectedness and intersectionality between different issues, and environmental issues, climate change is as much connected to questions of caste and gender, for example. And I wanted to ask Anushka if she would like to talk a little bit more about this context in her work.
In my practice is not necessarily, okay, let's pick up ecology and look at it through one exhibition and then leave it behind. It's about larger questions of sustainability, including sustainable methods of working, thinking through exhibition design and materiality, as well, just as much as looking at, say, practices that might be engaged in these subject matters for a long period of time. And especially when working on Columbus Scope, we were very sensitive to the fact that it was a festival that was on for 10 days. And then what happens when it all comes down? Right? So keeping these questions in mind while working on exhibitions. And for instance, when we worked on Language as Migrant, it was thinking through the proximity that Sri Lanka has as a context to questions on movement and also language politics, and also including movement within the island, not just the diaspora. But could we really think about that without bringing into conversation migratory birds? And so these are the aspects through which we've kind of looked at ecology, or working my long-term collaboration with the artist Amar Wasim, thinking about movement within the subcontinent, thinking of plants as more than human witnesses to historical erasure, and the narratives that emerge through that, and queering of ecology, and talking about marginal life forms in that way. And thinking of various sites. And recently, I was part of a conversation where I was asked why curators prefer to work with identity issues. But then I feel that, as Sabih mentioned earlier, as many of you mentioned earlier as well, there is an intervention upon art historical narratives that were given to us that occurs in our work, not just in terms of exhibition making and research, but even as an educator, it's about intervening within a curriculum, which I'm kind of engaged with these days. It's about intervening within a curriculum and looking at voices that have been historically marginalized and finding ways to bring it into focus in ways that's possible. Because, of course, limited by the subjectivity of a practitioner, but at the same time being motivated to do that. So that's some of the ways in which I've responded to this within my practice.
Yeah, and I think going forward, I'm sometimes a little bit worried what exhibitions will look like in the future, because I think often the ask is to create academic exhibitions that then fail to speak to a larger audience, or exhibitions are looked at almost as a space of lifestyle and entertainment, and it boils down to experience. And often there's not the chance to create context, discourse, sustain relationships with artists and so on. What are the questions that trouble you when you think about exhibition making in the future and the turns it's taking at that moment? To all of you.
I think vis-a-vis the exhibition, we certainly need a new idea of the exhibition in the 21st century, and it's not based on new kinds of exhibitions, new materials or spaces in which to exhibit, but what does it mean to exhibit anything, and what do exhibitions do? And if it's about really a space for discussions, a place for contemplation, and a place for really testing how things really historically have been assembled, and therefore trying to undo those assemblings. This is a very long answer, actually. I mean, actually, me and a friend, we've just recently written a book where the entire chapter is dedicated to the exhibition of the 21st century, and really trying to look at the exhibitionary complex, and trying to kind of dissociate it from merely exhibition making. And I think, at least to answer your question, one thing I'd say is that we need to maybe even undo and for a moment analyze terms like the audience and the public, and maybe test a few others around them. Because I think even the notion of the public right now is a public that arises from, on the one hand, a post-Me Too era, a post-BLM, Black Lives Matter era, a post-cancel culture era. So the public needing to be educated, the public needing to be informed, the public needing to be made aware through exhibitions is certainly not the only agenda that we have. In fact, maybe to push some things. And this is the strange thing that has happened with increasing institutionalization, as if all art practice aspires for institutionalization. Actually, all practice exceeds institutionality. And institutions are always trying to maybe contain them. And I'm not saying all institutions are a problem because they try to contain them, but that's the negotiation that's always happening. So the exhibitionary exceeds institutionality, and if it does that, then it actually promises to think of societies differently as opposed to audience numbers, footfall, these kinds of things. And then I think new questions will arise. But this is a kind of clumsy answer to something that would be nice to have more time to discuss.
Does anybody else want to take this? Or?
I can say one sentence because I think you were actually very eloquent, Sabih. It's just, I think I constantly struggle in the world that we live in today, that why does what I do matter? Or more broadly, how do we make it matter? And I imagine that this is something that most curators think about, that why is this relevant?
I think it's an exciting time for exhibitions, and I mean, recently and I mean, the forms of it are so different now and so diverse also. I mean, we spent a year doing a reading group online with artists who were working with agrarian practices, and the question was also not necessarily about what is your practice in this, but can we read together, can we have conversations? And then we sort of came up with a small reading room that was actually extracted from WhatsApp conversations and images that was going on through the year on this group, sort of thinking of it, we kind of created a small configuration of a reading room of that whole process, and then invited people to be part of the conversation further. So I think there is a lot of generative possibilities. I also, like, as much as I fetishized artists and I continue to learn from them, I'm very happy about the fact that they've opened up, and that they don't control the way that exhibitions need to be received, or the way that artworks need to be encountered. That was a problem of, say, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, especially when you were working within institutions. Today, artists are much more open in terms of how they are sort of thinking about what this encounter with the audience will be. And as Sabih was also mentioning, how one would think of the question of the audience, how one would think of the question of the production of work, or, these are also become extremely open-ended and sort of feeding into each other in very interesting ways. So I don't know, I mean, I think there are all kinds of exhibitions happening, and I see in Delhi lots of artists, young artists opening up their own studio spaces, having as much of a vibrant art scene in their own homes, and creating a kind of a conversation and a coming together as in any other big public institution or at FICA or any of these spaces. So there is an energy, and there's a lot of possibility of the exhibition and the curatorial, which I think everyone is sort of participating in very interesting ways right now. So I'm quite excited.
I think that's very much at the heart of curatorial practice, and at the same time, I also feel often the role of the curator is to drive it back to things that you just mentioned. But at the same time, I don't want to pretend as if institutional structures, funding, for example, does not matter, because as much as I would want to believe that a lot is possible, and we just have to open up the space, and we have to have sustainable relationships, and we look at artist practices and bring them into the exhibition space and so on. At the same time, we work around censorship, we work around self-censorship a lot in this country. We work around funding structures that are based on financial calendars and so on, demands by the institution that may not represent what we want to do. And I think as much as there is a certain freedom of doing things, and as much as it's our job to continuously push for that, there's a lot of pushback that one has to fight with all the time. But yeah, I wanted to open up this floor to the audience as well and see if there are any questions from all of you.
Arnika, to your point about self-censorship, and this is something I was thinking of, also given all the polarizing debates we've had recently, what are the curatorial strategies that you're possibly employing to counter this kind of self-censorship or the debates that are happening, if at all?
Can go. And this is a question that I've been thinking about quite closely in various contexts that I've worked in. And arriving at this realization that the primary concern as a curator is to sustain critical conversations and make sure that they can continue to happen in ways that are safe for artists. And that involves various subversive strategies and methods of working. For instance, to come back to the question of audience, increasingly, I have been thinking about the exhibition model as something that is incidental to a much larger project. And the exhibition model, that is the show and tell that might be required for fundraising or various other requirements. But at the same time, thinking about communities, contingent communities that can emerge at the locus of an artwork, and that can perhaps start much earlier, even to the exhibition, or continue even much later beyond an exhibition. And thinking about meaningful communities, contingent or otherwise, I don't mean, by community, I don't mean a demographic at all. And thinking about the various meaningful conversations that can occur in such ways, rather than just through the public exhibition model and the quantifiable audience, treating the quantifiable audience as the main purpose of an exhibition or a project.
Just quickly to add to that, I think one of the strategies, and that's not necessarily just a curatorial strategy, but even a kind of historical strategy, is to resist the instrumentalization of artworks. You know, even from the perspective of making an intervention in this climate, whether it's in the US or here, to kind of resist the tyranny of the about this work is about this situation or about this issue, but really to do the work, as Anushka was saying, of really spending the time to think about the terms in which the curator acts as a mediator in these situations and is able to read into and present works in ways that actually open up the multiplicities and the complexities that they are constructed of. And so I think rather than making a claim that you can foresee as being immediately polarizing, to understand how the work is actually, in many cases, far more complex than a sentence that, you know, puts it under the banner of an issue that people are already extremely on one side of or the other. I think that is something that comes as a specific responsibility in moments like this, but is generally something I think we all try and do in different ways.
I think at least having worked in projects in mainland China, having worked in projects in Arab countries, and well, engaging with so many friends and artists here, I don't think there's a textbook answer for this. I think it's different kinds of approaches at different kinds of times, and among the things that seem consistent in so many different contexts where certain kinds of regimes are monitoring very closely, and not just regimes, even society participating in certain kinds of polarization, is that one, how to say without saying, how to say something without necessarily saying it. Two, that not fall into the same polarization narrative or the same dichotomies, because sometimes actually they want you to precisely fall and take one side of that and rather complicate it and present more nuanced instances. Three, not like just fall into the trap of this Western liberal notion of declarative politics, that until you declare, until then you're not political or something like that, that actually there are many other ways of of articulating, expressing, and when required, then actually declaring as well. So no textbook answer. But on having said that, and at the risk of maybe sounding like it might be treating it as trivial, because otherwise it is very real, is that actually in such times, then you realize that actually art is having power. That's why certain regimes are scared. Because until politics is decorative, that means it's like whatever, you know. So actually in so many places, why there is a lot of clampdown and things is because actually those regimes and those societies recognize the power of what art and people saying things can do, because that might have a ripple effect into creating all kinds of things. So in fact, it is probably a recognition of that. And so then in this particular instance, we might actually be seeing a moment of real reckoning, because at least of late, since the boom and bust that has happened since 2006 onwards, with, you know, like we're in the fair and we talk about the Indian art market and all, one sees two dominant forces at work. One, this whole narrative that art is a luxury, elitist commodity. That's one side. And the other, with more and more nonprofits and so-called institutions coming into the picture. And I say so-called because I think we really need to reevaluate what is institution at the moment, because it's being so loosely used for anything. Institutions are not just anything you just start. And I mean, what about longevity? What about not public accessibility, public accountability, all of these things, right? So on the one hand, there's a whole luxury commodity aspect, and that art is elitist. And this narrative, unfortunately, even puts artists into guilt trips, even though they can't even pay their rents. They consider themselves as elitists because once a year they attend an art fair party. And on the other, art becomes this charitable thing that, oh, we need to protect art and things like that, right? So you end up having this weird dichotomy between something that is completely effete and a luxury commodity, and something that is also effete because it is a charitable kind of thing that needs support. Whereas actually it has the power to do things, and that's why on the one hand, places are instrumentalizing it. On the other, it is scaring people. And it is changing the so-called military security complex into a high insecurity complex. So in fact, maybe then art is actually starting to do something as well that we need to reckon with very, very intelligently.
I have a question for Sabih. Sabih, I like your terminologies which you use, like care and then ethical, and some other terminologies you have used, especially these terminologies when we say curatorial, how we translate into pedagogy in education. If you can cite some examples, you have spoken about Ruang Rupa document. So can you speak about more, care, maybe care of self or Foucault's idea or something like that? So yeah.
Thank you. I think there's, how do I answer? So I think the space of pedagogy is extremely powerful. And you can see the history of the 20th century, where universities were very important grounds for where all kinds of public movements and social movements began, whether it's in the late 1970s and the autonomous women's movement here in India, or so many other kinds of protests, or even in fine art colleges and stuff. So, which include Baroda, which include universities here in Delhi, Bangalore, Kerala. You name it. So universities have been huge places of social transformation. And I think the commercialization of education and everything has ended up infantilizing the idea of pedagogy, that, these are bachas, they need to be taught, and then they can enter the real world and stuff like that. So, and I think what's exciting is that that's kind of changing. The kind of solidarities that Anushka was talking about between students, practitioners, teachers, all of that's really charged up right now. And if we don't take it seriously and just consider this as, oh, this is just, on the side, because the main field is the art industry or something, then we're actually missing the point. Because that's where a lot of transformation is happening. And it's not about the future generation coming, but the future of ideas coming.
Okay, I think this is a good note to end this on as well. And thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for the audience for coming here today, and the interpreter, of course, as well. Yeah, have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnika.